Suddenly, as the driver approached a desolate stop, 3 figures materialized from the darkness. However, something about them was unsettling. It was a bitterly cold winter night in Beijing, and the city's streets were eerily quiet. The final bus to Fragrant Hills, known as Bus 375, stood waiting at the terminal. Its engine rumbled softly, sending puffs of smoke into the icy air. The clock struck midnight, and the driver, a stoic middle-aged man, closed the bus doors. This was the last ride of the day, a lonely journey to the remote Fragrant Hills. Few ever boarded at this hour, and tonight was no different. Among the passengers were a young couple seated near the front, whispering softly to each other. An elderly woman, bundled up against the cold, sat toward the back, her sharp eyes scanning her surroundings. A solitary man, engrossed in his book, occupied a seat in the middle. The conductor, a tired and slightly irritable man, walked up and down the aisle, checking tickets and keeping an eye on the sparse crowd. The bus pulled out of the terminal and rumbled through the deserted streets. The flickering streetlights cast long, dancing shadows, and the sound of the tires crunching over the frosty road was the only noise breaking the silence. Everything seemed normal until the bus reached a dimly lit stop on the outskirts of the city. The bus glided through the dimly lit streets, its headlights barely cutting through the dense fog. Suddenly, as the driver approached a desolate stop, 3 figures materialized from the darkness, their forms hazy and unsettling under the pale streetlights. At first glance, they appeared to be 2 men supporting a frail third person between them. However, something about them was unsettling. They were dressed in traditional Qing dynasty robes, their attire centuries out of date. The taller man carried the faint figure, whose face was obscured by a thin veil. The other man, shorter and with an unnatural stiffness to his movements, waved at the bus. The conductor hesitated. The sight was strange, but it was late, and he didn't want trouble. The driver shrugged and opened the door. The 3 figures climbed aboard silently, their presence immediately altering the mood inside the bus. They made their way to the back, their footsteps eerily light, as if they barely touched the floor. The other passengers avoided making eye contact, but an air of unease settled heavily over them. As the bus continued its journey, the temperature inside seemed to drop. The passengers huddled closer to their seats, their breath visible in the frosty air. The young couple whispered nervously, glancing occasionally at the newcomers. The elderly woman sitting near the back stared openly at them, her sharp gaze unyielding. Something wasn't right. The men in Qing robes sat unnaturally still, their faces pale and expressionless. The veiled figure didn't move at all, as if it wasn't alive. The elderly woman suddenly stood up, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Young man," she barked, pointing at the young man seated with his girlfriend. "You stole my wallet." The young man jumped, startled. "What? No, I didn't. What are you talking about?" "You did. I saw you," she insisted, her voice growing louder. "We're getting off at the next stop, and you're coming with me to the police station." The young man's girlfriend tried to calm the situation, but the old woman wouldn't back down. She grabbed the young man's arm and pulled him toward the front of the bus. Reluctantly, he followed her, clearly confused. The driver stopped the bus at the next stop, and the elderly woman dragged the young man out onto the deserted street. As soon as the bus drove away, she released his arm and turned to face him, her expression grave. "Listen to me," she said in a low voice. "I lied about the wallet. I had to get you off that bus." The young man stared at her, confused and angry. "What are you talking about? Why did you do that?" The old woman's voice dropped to a whisper. Those men on the bus. They weren't human. Did you notice? They didn't have feet. The young man's blood ran cold. He hadn't noticed, but the conviction in the woman's voice sent chills down his spine. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I've lived long enough to know when something's wrong," she said. "Those men, and that figure they were carrying, they didn't belong here. If we had stayed, something terrible would have happened to us." Before the young man could respond, the bus disappeared into the distance, its taillights flickering like dying embers. The two of them stood in the cold, silent night, the weight of the woman's words sinking in. The next morning, news of Bus 375 spread like wildfire. The bus had never reached its destination. Authorities found it submerged in a reservoir far off its route. Inside were the charred remains of the driver, the conductor, and the passengers. The vehicle's fuel tank was inexplicably empty, and yet there were no signs of an explosion. The incident became the stuff of urban legend. Witnesses claimed they had seen the bus speeding through the night with an eerie glow, its windows filled with shadowy figures. Some said they heard faint screams echoing in the distance. Theories ranged from supernatural intervention to a collision with another dimension. The young man never forgot the experience. He avoided late-night buses and often replayed that night in his mind, wondering what might have happened if the old woman hadn't intervened. As for the elderly woman, she refused to speak of the event again, retreating into a quiet, solitary life. Years later, the story of the last bus to Fragrant Hills remains a chilling reminder of the unknown. Locals still whisper about it, warning others to avoid the midnight bus. Some claim to see shadowy figures waiting at the same bus stop, vanishing as soon as they're approached.